I te whakaminenga, tēnā koutou katoa, koutou o te kāhui tika tangata, Pereri, Jessica Mā, koutou no koutou te reo pōhiri, kia tātū mai mātou te toko toru nei, ki te kōrero mō te reo Maori. E te minita tēnā koe, ko koe tēnā kua roa e pakana ana kia whai mana tō tātou reo. Nau I whakaaro nui, hea rānei, kia noho koe tētahi o ai nā kai tohu mō te ture hau. Engari, nōku te maringa nui, kia whai wāhi atu mātou ko aku hoa kai tohu I a koe. Kei te tūnane ngāhiwi, te tumu whakarai o te taurawhiri, nā ringaringa waiwai hoki o te minita, tēnā koe o tira koutou katoa kua tātū mai I tēnei ahi pō, tēnā koutou katoa. It's a real honour and privilege to be invited here today to discuss a topic that's very dear to my heart, the right to language. And alongside my esteemed colleagues, I too have a passion for te reo, and my work and research to date has primarily focused on language planning and policy. And despite being a relatively new field of study, Māori have often been at the forefront of language revitalisation efforts, and the Minister referred to this, and consequently many Indigenous peoples turn to Māori as leaders in this space and often adopting our own practices. I've had the privilege of not only being an academic but also involved in creating new theories on language revitalisation, some of which Ngahi we touched on before, and influencing the current policy landscape and contributing, of course, to the recent Māori Language Act passed last year. As Pereri talked about, I've a board member of Te Mātāwai, recently appointed, which is the new entity that emerged as a result of the latest legislation. Te Mātāwai, as the Minister described, has oversight of the Maihi Māori or the Māori language strategy for Māori. And my appointment to Te Mātāwai meant that I came off the board of Te Māngai Pāho and Te Taurawhiri Te Reo Māori. And as the Minister said, I chaired his Māori Language Advisory Group to this, and our findings were essentially adopted and included in the new legislation. Now, he describes me as the architect behind the legislation. I like to think I'm more the civil engineer. So actually the ideas for the legislation didn't actually come from me. So the blueprint came from people like Sir Tamati Riri and Te Paipai Motuhake, which was established by his predecessor, by the Minister's predecessor. And my job, alongside my colleagues, was to kind of look at the design and the construction and how future maintenance of such a construction. So Te Whare o Te Reo Mauriora, as I've said, was the creation of others in terms of its original design, and we came in as civil engineers to tighten up the shape of the house and help with its construction. So just want to make an acknowledgement of those people and others who have also fought for the rights of te reo. In thinking about, so basically as an academic, and one that studies language planning and policy, all things around language planning and policy really is my jam. I love it. I talk about it all the time. My students know that this is what I talk about. But one of the things I want to acknowledge the UNDRIP for specifically is that in its recommendations and the way these are framed in terms of the UNDRIP is taking it almost probably not necessarily in a knowing way, but maybe, I'm not sure because I wasn't behind the design of that, a very language planning approach to revitalisation. So as it says here, Indigenous peoples have the right to revitalise, use, develop and transmit to future generations. And I think this is an important part around the rights around use, development and transmission to future generations. And that the government's role is really around to take steps to protect these rights. Now, in the New Zealand context, language planning and policy, and more specifically Māori language revitalisation efforts have come about as a result of community initiatives. So they came about as movements before they became institutions. So Kohanga Reo, Kura Kaupapa, Te Aotārangi started as organic, Indigenous-driven movements. The government's approach to protecting our rights has shifted them into an institution that often has them tied up in knots with regulations and policies that the government impose on it as part of that protection. And so often we have this tension between what is a movement and what is an institution. And in the language space, we have a number of those. So kohanga, as I said, kura kaupapa, not so much ātarangi, but there are parts of their organisation where they are, wānana. They all started off as movements amongst the people for language revitalisation, but in order to sustain them and the government's role in that, they have turned them into institutions. And this can often be a tension amongst themselves in the way that that's been designed. So language planning and policy in this country has had a very ad hoc approach to it. So where Indigenous peoples have taken the initiative to reverse language shift, often these have come within the construct of the Crown's policy. So as we know, it takes one generation to lose a language and 3 generations to restore it. And so 3 generations is actually quite a long game. Language revitalisation is not a sprint, it's a marathon. And often, because when you're constrained by government policy and a results-based framework within usually one political term, a 3-year outcome is not as obvious as a 30-year outcome. So when thinking about planning and policy, we often get tied up in we need a result within 3 to 5 years because the minister says so. But actually language revitalisation, you need 3 generations to actually see those results. And as the minister referred to, there have been a lot of families who come from either 3rd generation loss or up to 5 or 6 generations since the last person in their whānau spoke te reo Māori. So even for themselves, not having 1 generation at all within just say our normal nan and koro, mama and papa and the children, within that often the struggle is harder because there is no starting point within that whānau. So it's not about just today's generation, it's actually about 2 generations ahead, and thinking and what does it mean to plan for 2 generations ahead when we're not sure what that's going to look like ourselves. So we can only guesstimate on what are the needs of our own mokopuna, maybe someone's tuarua tuatorus, because they already have mokopuna, but how do we set a platform in language policy and planning that is actually going to be sustainable for our future generations? So I was trying to guess what my mates were going to talk about today, so I'm going to go through a very swift theoretical framework to kind of get me to the other end, and just kind of getting people into the same sense of how language policy has been developed and what actually moved us into creating Te Whare o Te Reo Moriora. So this is real quick, and there's questions later so we can talk about this. So one of the key things, and the minister talked about this used to be his pet cry, is around increasing numbers and proficiency. And often it's represented in this space. So people talked about the declining numbers of speakers. So you have a very elite small group at the top and of fluent speakers and cascading down to receptive. So in increasing numbers and proficiency, this shape, in your mind looks like a mountain. And so if you're at the receptive end, it looks like a long way to the top, ne? So in thinking about proficiency is always hard. And often the emphasis, as even the minister talked about, is on education. School them up, to send them to school, learn more language. Everybody's got to learn language. Ako, 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 ako seems to be the approach that most people took, is that you've got to feed it into the education system. But then, of course, you have the flip side, is that once they leave the classroom, there's no more speaking. So ako forms one part of language policy, but it's not the only part. Those of you who are a nerd like me and read language theory will know who Fishman is. So Joshua Fishman is his GID scale, or Graded Intergenerational Disruption Scale, has a similar effect as the other pyramid or maunga that I put up before, in that there's 8 steps towards language revitalisation, and he graded people on that to show whether your language vitality was. 8 steps again, but like the mountain approach, just seems a little bit too hard. Too many steps to get through in order to have language revitalisation. But did form many and influence the way language policy has been developed over time. The government for a long time has had the stronghold on Māori language planning and policy. And in doing so, since 1999, when its first strategy came out, was primarily about the Crown and all the agencies that they were responsible. However, this shifted with more language theory behind them. And of course, those who, again, nerd like me, does language revitalisation theories, these 5 rings, or as Tūrora's brother-in-law says, the Great Rings of Fire, status, corpus, critical awareness, acquisition and use, are also fundamental parts of language planning and policy. However, when the strategies in 2003, and that strategy particularly was adopted not only by the Crown but Māori too as the only strategy, it still fell within the construct of the Crown's determinations, their budget, and they determined what it should look like. So there was very little for intergenerational growth. There was a lot around more formalised language acquisition. One of the other criticisms that my colleague and I, Poia Rewi from Victoria University, talk about is that when you analyse the Crown's Māori language strategy, it has a very chicken and egg effect. So how it's designed is, which one do we resource the most? Because we only have a limited pool. Do we put it in acquisition, or do we put it in critical awareness, or status, or corpus, or use? And often you get this kind of spiralling effect that actually nothing gets done very well, but everyone defaults back to acquisition as being the key. Numbers and proficiency, increasing proficiency being a key thing. So of course, every political cycle, we get and somebody mentioned it before, around the Greens policy for compulsory education. Compulsory education is one of the political footballs that gets used all the time. And then as we go through the different theories, people get worn down. They analyse the resourcing. Have we got enough? Have we got enough corpus? Have we got enough critical awareness? We don't have enough teachers. And then we end up with, let's just park it. Let's park it now because the election's over, and then we'll wait for another 3 or 4 years, and then we'll raise that issue again. So those are the other things. And the last one I really want to talk about is reversing language shift. So reversing language shift is essentially what revitalisation is about. One of the scales that is used is to use very provocative terms to kind of put languages, endangered languages, on a scale. So we go from extinct all the way through to safe, so in a very graded type approach. Now these terms are meant to be provocative. They're meant to kind of go, and highlight the severity of language loss. But one of the things it does also have the effect of is the shock value can also turn people the other way. So you kind of think, oh my gosh, the language is dying. That's somebody else's problem. Rawinia and Tūroro and Ngahiwi, they're going to sort it out. In the meantime, I'm not going to bother because it's dying anyway. So it's just a too hard basket. One of the things that it also has the tendency to make people apathetic and despondent, but we must be cautious as those who are fighters for the rights of language, not to get too caught up in these terms, and because it does have the effect of inducing language trauma. So Ngahiwi and the Minister both talked about different types. They probably didn't describe it in that way. So where you have 3 generations of people who don't speak te reo Māori, it can induce language trauma of, I have no language in my whānau. Or if your nani and koro were beaten at school, that can induce language trauma. Now this is not to dismiss the punishment that our people went through, but when you have not suffered it directly, we need to be cautious that we're not replicating or finding ways of inducing our own language trauma on something that we've never actually ever experienced ourselves, and thus inducing language coma, i.e. no language is actually getting spoken. So I'm always, as an academic, always pushing back at language trauma. Yes, it existed, but we have to be cautious that we don't buy into it, in so much that we have the opportunity to understand language planning and policy and reverse language shift for the betterment of our own people. So earlier I talked about Māori leading the way in terms of language revitalisation and reversing language shift. And my colleagues here have spoken about it. We have over 400 kohanga reo, we have 72 kura kaupapa Māori and wharekura, about 29 Māori language radio stations, 2 television channels on Māori television, 1 in te reo, 1 bilingual. We have a Māori Language Commission. There's been an estimated $225 million in resourcing from the Crown that goes to te reo. Publications, many publications, but despite all these efforts, te reo Māori is still on UNESCO's list as an endangered language. And so we are leading for Indigenous peoples. However, we still seem to be suffering, and part of that is not understanding planning and policy. So where are we at? Ngahi, we talked about this. We have 1 in 5 people who are speakers of te reo Māori. 5% of that 1 in 5, so it's not 5% of the total population, 5% of the 1 in 5, who claim to speak Māori language very well. Now, one of the things as a researcher I'm always pushing out there, we need to be cautious around proficiency scales, because they don't actually, they're not very helpful. Proficiency is very hard to measure because it's all relative to who you're standing next to or measuring yourself next to. So within my whānau, we have 3 generations of supposed language speakers. I've got a native language speaking mother, and there's me, second language learner, and my child, also a second language learner. And if I'm measuring myself next to my child, then I'm fluent as. Next to my mother, bit otaia, maybe at best, can follow. So proficiency measuring is really, it doesn't give you enough clues as to how strong the language is. And we need to be better at asking better questions. So as carrying on with our statistics, in our homes, if we're thinking of intergenerational transmission, only 2.6% of speakers use te reo Māori as their primary language. So that's still of the 1 in 5, still not very big numbers. And 10% use an equal mix of Māori and English. And finally, 1 in 10 Māori children access te reo Māori at school. So in our policy and planning, we spend a lot of time attributing schools as being the panacea, the silver bullet to Māori language revitalisation. Yet for Māori people, only 1 in 10 of our kids are actually accessing it. And in this case, primarily in the preschool and not even moving forward. So when education or formal education becomes the default platform, people always try to measure what is the impact of te reo. And this is hard because the numbers are small. So we need to peel it back a little bit more. So thinking about Māori language rights, we have to talk about, of course, the petition. And thinking about how we have got to where we are today, the people who fought primarily for the Māori language petition were first or second year generation urban migration, no language, first language was te reo, Pākehā, and were university educated. So most of them had no language but fought for te reo but help to raise critical awareness. And then we kind of jump forward another 10 years to the Y11 claim. And this is all going to become a little bit obvious when I get to it soon. But of course, Y11 is important, and Ngahi, we talked about this around the taonga, acknowledgement of te reo being a taonga under Article 2 of the treaty, and of course the result being the legislation. So this first piece of legislation, official status, tautawhiri is created, can speak te reo in courts and get licenses for translators and interpreters. Now the reason why I want to talk about Y11 is that in the report is a whole list of the objections to the Māori language claim. Now when you read through all of these, some of these objections you're going to hear coming up soon when the Green Party puts out their policy for te reo Māori, and this is the response that New Zealand continues to make primarily when it comes to te reo Māori. So there is no need for recognition because Māori people can speak English anyway. Well, of course we can speak English. We are one of the most monolingual countries in the world. And as I've said in my lectures to my students, we are more English than the English when it comes to te reo. You know, if you go on the tube in London, you will struggle to find people speaking English. It is very multilingual, but here we in the colony are more British than the mothership. So just keeping that in mind. Māori language cannot meet the needs of modern society. Yet another fallacy that continues to get perpetuated, that Māori language cannot keep up with modern times. And this is again back to the UNDRIP, the right to be able to develop language. Since we arrived in Aotearoa, Māori have continually adapted to new environments, new peoples, new situations, and created language as a result. Now, I always laugh at this one because it cracks me up that Pākehās think that they are the only ones that come up with new language all the time. And yet a lot of the language is actually borrowed language. It's not actually English, it's borrowed from another country. So who can't keep up in the modern society? I'm not sure. Anyway, but continues to perpetuate a colonial thought if you say that Māori cannot keep up with modernity, because it always has and will continue. But be able to exercise our right to develop is often stymied by attitudes such as this. So English is an international language and therefore much more useful. Instead of unpacking that from a language planning perspective, being bilingual actually makes you smarter. So the more languages you know, the better and cleverer you are. That might be why Tūroro might be clever. Anyway, so I'm not gonna go through every single one because they're up there. And there's pages of objections in Y11, and these pages, as I've said before, will continue to be said in people's debates about whether te reo Māori should be compulsory in education or not. So it's nothing new. So this is 1985, fast forward to 2017, the same thing is being said about te reo Māori. Tūroro already talked about Hene Wehi Mohi and her challenge by singing to the country, by singing in te reo Māori. So protestation has its role in terms of fighting for the rights of te reo Māori. She managed to change society, change the way we think. So today's generation will never actually know that te reo Māori was only ever spoken in English when we were kids, or if you're of a particular vintage. But some of them are a bit younger. But these attitudes, and Tūroro's right, and I find it ironic that he had to go to Wales and Ireland to find out about attitude, when Poya and I have been talking about it for ages, but probably because we come from Rātoki and Murupara respectively, so what do these little bush kids know? But hoi anō, in terms of attitudes and values, I like to call this the Gollum effect, and some of you who've read the Dominion Post probably have seen me talk about this, where we're fixated on Article 2 of the treaty, he taonga te reo, Taurewhiri's great at putting up these slogans. Aroha nui te reo, he taonga te reo. We tell our kids, reo rangatira tēnei, taonga te reo, taonga te reo, taonga te reo, all the time. Particularly in July, he taonga te reo, taonga te reo, he taonga te reo, reo rangatira. Yet, we continue to speak English. Love the language, love it so much. But we still speak English. Why is that? Why do we still speak English? So like Gollum, we have this love-hate relationship going on with te reo Māori. So it becomes my precious, nobody else's. But actually, in order for it to be a living language, we need to be able to communicate. It is just a language. It is a, yes, it has some, I'm going to get to that before the haters start hanging on me. Yes, it has got other value elements to it, but one of the things that makes, and Ngahi, we brought up Article 3 and citizenship, which is something that Poya and I have written about and talked about a lot. We need to shift away from the Article 2 mantra and think about Article 3 in terms of citizenship. And as the Minister talked about Wales and Ireland and how their language policies are delivered out, a lot of that is related to their identity. So as we as a country use te reo Māori as one of our most distinctive defining features as New Zealanders, then within Article 3 we have a bigger uptake of language users. Because as the Minister said, it's everywhere. You actually can't avoid te reo Māori in this country. You bump into it every time, as he said. And it actually defines the way we speak English. So even our English is actually defined by te reo Māori in what we say. So on TV, we hear the All Blacks saying, oh, that game, there was a lot of mana. Everybody knows what he's talking about. Might not say it right, but still, there was some mana in that rugby game. So, oops, I'm getting towards the end. So attitudes and research are often defined as being superficial and opinion-based. And values, again, there's not a lot of research in this area. But of course, attitudes and your values don't always influence your behaviours. So you might value something, but doesn't actually mean you're going to either use the language and as such. So there's underlying, so with the values, there are general underlying orientations of your internal dynamic. And the Paipai Motuhake Se Tāmasi reading them came up with seven of these values that they described in their report. And depending on which value you're prepared to apply, can either shift you positively or negatively towards or away from the language. So intrinsically, we might love te reo Māori, taonga te reo, it's all about my identity, but actually I'm not going to say anything. I'm not going to use the language. So understanding language planning and policy, you need to understand what shifts people from a zero to a passive to an active state and what moves them the other way around. And so in policy, and this is where I want to kind of end up on, in policy itself, we find that we kind of make decisions for the language and we think, oh, that sounds really good, but actually it does nothing for the language. So the example that I'm going to give you is that in the Tertiary Education Commission, who determines the policy for my sector, has attributed 4 times the weighting of funding to a Māori language PhD or master's thesis. So from the outside, they write a policy like this, and you go, "Fuck, that's mean." They value te reo Māori with 4 times the funding. How it actually works in practice, it doesn't in many ways, because the student who writes the thesis doesn't get any of that money. It all goes to the institution. So it's the institution's, it's for the institution to drive that policy, but it doesn't do anything to entice students to want to do it because they don't get the money. So policy looks good, practice not so good. And so, well, you can't really see that, sorry. So what we did with the Māori Language Advisory Group is that we took 2 key language planning and policy theories around micro-language planning, and so as Tūrero described, Te Mātāwai looks after the micro-language planning for Māori, and the Crown side is the macro-language. And the reason why we separated the two is it allows Māori to determine what are the needs inside the home and the community, and that the Crown determines what's needed for society. So the two mahi, and despite the Minister saying that he doesn't think it's a good idea, actually, from a language planning and policy perspective, it allows some determination and also acknowledgement of our treaty partnership. So whilst it acknowledges what UNDRIP also talked about, it also acknowledges our treaty relationship, which allows Māori to determine what's good for Māori, and the Crown to also be responsible for society with one shared vision. And so inside the House, the smaller side is the taraiti, taking that Māori paradigm, and the Crown. But also, as we know in our design, the popos face each other. And prior to this, in language revitalisation, Māori weren't often in the same space as the Crown in terms of determining what was needed for language revitalisation. That encourages organic movement growth, like how Kohanga and Kura Kaupapa started, but also is supported within the country to make them see that their attitudes and values towards things Māori should also be promoted and not just left for Māori to determine and drive and be under-resourced. But hoi anō, koe na noi ho tāku, mō tēnei wā, kia ora tātou.